Could you tell us more about Breakthrough Cancer?
Sure. So as you know, Breakthrough Cancer is a new foundation, which will be launching just this Thursday. It grows out of a long-standing relationship that has existed between the principal donor family and the 5 institutions that represent the founding partners of Breakthrough Cancer. Bill and Alice Goodwin and their children have been supporting cancer research at MIT's Koch Institute, along with the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center for several years, and simultaneously Memorial Sloan Kettering, the Kimmel Cancer Center at Hopkins, and MD Anderson. And they made the suggestion a few years ago that there might be value if we all came together and joined forces and worked together on a common set of problems, and expressed some interest in providing funding for that. And we took them up on that, we the institutional leaders, and over the last few years have been generating what is now Breakthrough Cancer, a self-standing foundation, which is dedicated to changing the way that science is brought to the clinic for the benefit of cancer patients, to support teams of investigators from those 5 institutions and potentially others, to be bold and try to change the course of very difficult to treat cancers. We're focusing on 4 today. They are pancreas cancer, ovarian cancer, glioblastoma, and AML. And we're hopeful that with the ingenuity and technical capabilities that exist within those institutions, the explicit backing of the leaders of those institutions, and significant funding from the Goodwin family, that we'll be able to make a real difference.
Got it. You talked a bit about the Genesis story and how the institutions came together. Could you tell us more about the original reasons for them to come together and how this came about, basically?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Goodwin family, and here I mentioned Bill and Alice and their children, and I'll particularly mention Hunter Goodwin, who's now since passed away from cancer himself. That family has been very supportive of cancer research for many years. And they were doing that more on an institution-specific basis. The idea of coming together was really from their inspiration, and we actually did physically come together. About 3 years ago, we actually gathered investigators from all of our institutions who were working on the 4 diseases I just mentioned, in fact, and came together for a meeting at Kiowa Island, the resort at Kiowa Island, and spent a couple of days actually going through concepts and projects and basically new thinking about those diseases, which we might be able to make come true were we to bring these institutions together with the right kind of resourcing. And so that was the beginning. That was really the genesis. And then it's taken us now a few years to think through the specifics of that. COVID, of course, happened, and that changed our trajectory a bit. Although honestly, I think it's help us think about what urgency means. We can talk a bit about that if you're interested. So that's really how it all happened.
Let's talk about that. We're interested.
I think it's a fascinating subject, Paul, and I think that it's obviously on all of our minds. And for me, at least, it falls into 2 relevant categories. The first is a sense of what can be done when people work together. And I think we've seen that in the case of the response of the scientific community to the COVID-19 pandemic. Researchers from all over the world are pooling their talents and sharing information and learning from each other with a focus on progress as opposed to individual accomplishment. Progress as opposed to papers, I like to say. Mm-hmm. And I love that attitude. And I'd like to see that attitude brought into Breakthrough Cancer as well. So that's one thing. So collaboration is very much behind our success in the fight against this pandemic. And you guys know as well as I do just how remarkable that has been. It's been less than 14 months since the sequence of the virus was reported. And now there have been close to 1 billion COVID-19 tests performed in that period of time, and more than 200 million people who've been vaccinated against this virus. So just unbelievable. That could not have happened without the cooperative activity that I was referring to. Mm-hmm. The other that is important for us to focus on, and here I'm hearkening on my experiences with the Moonshot Initiative, a sense of urgency. I like to say, let's do this work like our lives depended on it. I think that's a very important perspective, like our lives depended on it. I think the pandemic response kind of had that quality to it, like our lives depended on it. And here, of course, people's lives do depend on it. That's the message that Joe Biden delivered to us as part of the Moonshot Initiative. He didn't use those words exactly. He talked about urgency in different ways, but that sense of urgency and that sense of shared purpose. So I think we bring that perspective, and I think the experiences that we've had with COVID are highly influential for me, and I think for all of us involved.
So to put this in a nutshell, what will Breakthrough Cancer do that's not being done now?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated answer, Paul. I think there's a lot of things that we're going to try to do. Let's put it that way. We have the institutional buy-in of 5 of the top cancer centers in the country to work together to support the efforts of researchers in their institutions in a collaborative fashion. Now, you might say collaboration always happens, and it's true, but it's not always supported from the institutions themselves. We have on the board of Breakthrough Cancer high-level representatives from each of those 5 institutions, and they are actively working to make this successful. Mm-hmm. That will require breaking down barriers that exist within and between the institutions that we could only do with their support. Moreover, Breakthrough Cancer will be different by virtue of the fact that we will help organize the research effort. And that's a distinction between this and perhaps every other version of this that I've been party to. That is to say, the board of Breakthrough Cancer, those individuals I just mentioned, the leadership, including myself and the chief scientific officer, our scientific advisory board, will all work with investigators from those institutions to find the best ideas, form the best teams, refine those ideas, and ultimately shape the projects that get pursued and reshape them as they're being pursued. That's a degree of an integrated approach to cancer research management that is unusual and something that I'm personally very committed to.
Got it. And how were the member institutions chosen, and why these institutions and not others?
Yeah.
Can other institutions join?
So the 5 that are our founding partners were chosen because they were already being supported by the Goodwin family. And so they were natural fits to be part of this collective effort. They're also outstanding. So that's another reason why they're on the list. But there are, of course, other outstanding cancer research institutions in the country and around the world. And indeed, we expect that over time, this effort will grow to include other cancer research institutions. And even now, our structures allow for teams to include investigators from an institution who is not one of those 5. So we want to be inclusive. And at the same time, and I think this is also important to me, and I think important to our success, having the institutions engaged and involved will help us be successful. And doing that with 5 is easier than doing it with 50.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's the budget of this endeavor, and how will the money be spent? Will it be like in increments over a certain number of years? I noticed that this is called a challenge grant. Are you raising more money elsewhere?
Yes. So the Goodwins have committed through a challenge, as you said, $250 million. We expect to raise roughly a similar amount of money over time. So imagine this being a $500 million effort. So quite significant resources, which in my view are required to do what we want to do, especially in the time that we want to do it. Exactly how the money will be spent is still being worked out in detail. We do expect these to be largely team-based research programs involving team members from the different institutions. So they will be multi-investigator awards, multi-institutional awards, and some of them at least, perhaps any of them, will be quite substantial. We want to bring the best science, the best technology to patients in the context of clinical investigation. And I can talk more about what I mean by that, but to do that is an expensive enterprise. And so these will be, in many instances, multi-million-dollar awards, and we're covering 4 diseases at the outset, likely multiple projects for each of those diseases. And so you can see how even that very large sum of money could be used in the next, 7 to 10 years very effectively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how will you ensure that there isn't an overlap or redundancy of efforts supported by other funders, i.e. NCI? Will you be working with the NCI and the Biden administration? Will Dr. Eric Lander, for instance, play a role in this?
Yeah, so obviously I know Eric Lander very well since he was my colleague at MIT. He technically still is my colleague, he's on leave. He is aware of what we're doing, and I'm sure, although we haven't talked about it in detail recently, supportive of this effort, I'm certain of it. I think that coordination at every level is very important. So of course we want to make sure that what we're doing is not superfluous and redundant with other similar efforts. So coordination with the NCI in particular, but not limited to the NCI, is something that we will do. I have told and engaged Ned Sharpless about this for a while now, including recently, and we expect to have high-level advisors from the NCI advising us through this process. So to the extent that we can coordinate and avoid redundancy, we will. And at the same time, we want to empower people who are engaged with us to bring their best thinking and not feel inhibited. And so we'll have to do that in a careful fashion. But yes, coordination is very important.
And how does Breakthrough Cancer allow these well-funded institutions to do things that they could not do otherwise, that are already done within their portfolio? And
yeah,
they probably have, they're probably part of all kinds of consortia that already involve each other.
There are a number of existing relationships between these institutions and between them and others, of course. And if, as you said, they're well-funded institutions. So how does this matter to them? I would say that there's many reasons why it matters. The nature of the research organization aspect that I mentioned before, just to give you some color on that, we have already reached out to individuals who were nominated by their institutions to be disease leads for their institution. Each institution nominated one person to be their lead for pancreas cancer, their lead for ovarian cancer, and so forth. We have 5 institutions, we have 4 diseases, that's 20 individuals, and we're reaching out to those individuals as individuals and as groups to begin to think together about how to pursue these problems. That is an unusual activity. So that is in itself distinctive. Getting agreement between the institutions to share information, co-analyze data, pursue clinical projects collectively. Although it happens at one level, I think it will happen differently through this activity. we know that there's great talent in each of those institutions. And at the same time, no one institution can have the best in every area. And the collective group here has outstanding people across a wide range. You know, myself at MIT, I've got engineering colleagues in the Koch Institute who actually bring a set of skills that really are not well replicated in other places. They can be brought into this picture in a seamless way through this collaboration. And that's just one of many examples.
Can we talk about peer review for a moment? Because I keep thinking about CPRED, you know, how that worked. And you were, of course, a very important part of that whole process. Like you could not really expect investigators from MD Anderson to review projects that originate at UT Southwestern, for example, or Baylor or whatever, any one of these. So how are you going to structure peer review? Can people from, say, MIT be on your peer review boards? Or will it be more like CPRIT, where you had non-Texas people review CPRIT grants from Texas institutions?
Right. So you're right. I was the chair of one of those review committees, and an interesting time, Paul, if you remember well. I learned a lot through that process, and honestly, I've learned a lot through all these things that I've done over the years that have some resemblance to what we're trying to do here. I think outside review is essential, right? It gets complicated. I've talked about the fact that we want to be engaged in project development and refinement and team building, but we need there to be outside eyes looking at what we're doing and providing that perspective. So our scientific advisory board, which consists of 11 people, come from other institutions outside of those 5. And let me just add a little bit of color, and this gets to something, Matt, you asked me. Why is this different? Why is it special? I invited 11 people to join SAB. All 11 said yes. Partly because I know them and I like them and they like me. But really, when I told them about what we were trying to do, they actually completely got it and understood that it was different. That it was different from other things like this that they had done. And so they're quite excited, actually, to be involved in this process of selection, as you were asking about, Paul, but also monitoring progress, reshaping as we go those projects. We know that science and clinical development is not linear. There will be things that we discover along the way that will cause us to change course and refocus our attention. So yeah, the outside SAB and outside review is critical.
So the Al Gilman approach is being used, basically.
Sorry, you broke up right there. Can you say that again?
So the Al Gilman approach is being used in a way, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Al Gilman knew that he couldn't have the investigators judging themselves and brought in people from outside of the state. We are bringing people from outside of these 5 institutions, and I think it's essential that we do that.
Fabulous.
So what would be the group's first initiative? Do you have 1 year, 5-year goals? Do you have an established plan for what you're going to pursue coming up?
You know, I think we'll get started with one of the 4 diseases that I mentioned, if not more than one. I think over time, just to add to that, we likely will bring in other challenging cancers. We know there are many more than those 4. 1-year goals. I want there to be teams funded, projects funded that feel and look different from what we're used to seeing, and that the activities, those research activities, are starting to manifest themselves. That the research across the institutions is actually happening. It's easy to talk about these things, it's harder to do them. I want to see evidence that it's actually happening. And over a 5-year horizon, I expect some of those ideas and hypotheses and experimental approaches to yield benefits to patients. We have to be realistic about how long it takes to solve a problem like pancreas cancer. It's not easy, or the other ones that I mentioned. And yet I do feel that with the right kind of science-driven approaches, we can begin to make a difference, even in that horizon, and then eventually translate that into even more meaningful outcomes for patients. One thing I didn't say to you in answer to an earlier question that I think is very poignant for me, and this was actually mentioned by one of my AB members. He said, we need to design something so that we learn from every patient. We learn from every patient who's involved in this activity. And that may seem obvious. Of course, you want to learn from every patient, but the reality is that the level of scientific investigation that goes along with clinical studies is usually quite limited, such that we can't learn from every patient. We want to change that paradigm. So what I'm hoping is that within that 1 to 5 year span, we'll actually change people's views about what a clinical investigation looks like. And then we can learn from every patient.